Okay, so this is the first part of the sheep brain dissection packet. We're actually first 2/3 of it, really. So I just want to run through the answers, make sure we're all on the same page with this stuff. Okay. So now that I'm actually on the handout, here we can go. Let's see. Anterior means that we are talking about the front portion of the brain, whereas the posterior means we're talking about the back. Lateral means to the side, to or at the side. Medial means to or at the middle. And dorsal normally refers to like our backside. With the sheep, really, it's kind of talking about the top of the brain, whereas the ventral is talking about the bottom. So let's check those answers real quick. Did quiz on these already a little bit. Okay, so that's good. Okay, plane. So we have frontal plane would divide the brain into front and back. Sagittal divides it into left and right parts, and horizontal divides it into top and bottom parts. All right. The three meningeal layers, the outermost, which is the one if I quizzed you and asked about meningeal layers, I probably talked about this one. It's the main one in terms of our sheep brain dissection because we could see it easily. We removed it. Underneath that, it's going to be the arachnoid layer. And underneath that would be the pia mater. All right. The meninges protect and support. Oops. The central nervous system only, right? Everybody good with that? Okay, so on the cerebrum, the raised portions are called gyri, plural, or a gyrus. The grooves in the cerebrum are called the sulci. What parts of the brain make up the brainstem? Now this should be these, but it included the cerebellum on the packet, didn't it? And then we have to label it in the diagram. All good with that? Almost done. Only 18 more. All right, so number 7, labeling this diagram. So the pons. So if we look from the back, the skinny portion right here, this is the uppermost part of the spinal cord. And then where it widens here, this is actually going to be the medulla. And then you kind of see some lines coming across here a little bit, which separates the medulla from the pons. All right, they already have the pituitary gland labeled. And then this is the bottom portion of the cerebellum. Good with that? All right, so part A name, I'm just going to say part A for me was the pons. Um, some motor control with the pons, but I want you to think of bridge between cerebellum and other parts of the brainstem. Part B is going to be the medulla and medulla oblongata. And this is going to be involved with heart rate, blood pressure, digestive activities. So this is involved with autonomic control. And part C would be the cerebellum. So this is involved with motor activities, use stored information, so based on previous movements. So kind of like our coordination, balance. All right. And then for pituitary gland, I really just want you, anything I'm going to ask you as far as quizzing goes about the brain is that you should know that it's a major link between the nervous and endocrine systems. Number 9, the oculomotor nerve is involved with eye movement. Optic nerves carry visual info to the optic chiasm. Olfactory refers to smell, so olfactory bulbs are involved with smell. And then the optic chiasm is for visual info crossing over. So this allows both hemispheres to kind of work together in terms of what we're seeing. And then the optic tract carries visual info back to visual cortex, where that information is processed. Okay, so labeling this diagram. So these things on the front here, those are the olfactory bulbs. So for smell. This gap down the middle is called the longitudinal median middle fissure. And so when we do our mid-sagittal cut, if you haven't done that yet, that's the next thing we're doing is cutting down the middle of the brain to make it into two parts. Next up is the optic nerves. So those are coming back. We had that big fat optic bulb up here, and then there were nerves running down. So this is the end of it here. And then the point where the visual information crosses over is the optic chiasm. That's this middle X part. Going back from that is going to be the optic tract. And then you might have noticed on your brain these two structures here kind of coming up like that, and those are the oculomotor nerves for eye movement. Okay, decussation is nerves or info crossing over to the other hemisphere of the brain. You see some questions and labeling about ventricles. Ventricles are cavities or openings in the brain. They contain cerebrospinal fluid. CSF. Labeling the next diagram. Pretty easy, just two things. So we have the cerebellum, and then they kind of raise the cerebellum so you can see the fourth ventricle underneath. So cerebellum and fourth ventricle on number 13. So this is cerebellum, fourth ventricle. All right, 14, more labeling. So on 14, we're labeling these two things here. This kind of flattened part, which is actually the inferior colliculus, or colliculi plural. And then the larger ones on top, which would be the superior. And then another view of that fourth ventricle. The top two structures, so the inferior colliculi and superior colliculi make up the tectum, which is part of the midbrain. It's part of the brainstem there. Good. All right. So 16, optic nerve again. Whoops. All right, and then this structure to the side is called the uncus. Sometimes it's also called the rhinencephalon. And this prefix rhine is actually referring to nose, like rhino. So that's actually going to have centers for processing smell, information related to smell. All right, next we have, so this is underneath where the pituitary gland was, what they call the mammillary bodies. The next part they're pointing at, this area here, a slightly raised portion, but this is the hippocampal gyri. So when you make the frontal cuts at the end, when you come through this section, we're going to try to see that area, which is known as the hippocampus, which is a pretty important thing too, which I ask about here in a second. And then they call this fissure along here, along the outside, the rhinal fissure. Okay, 17, what's important about the uncus? I was looking for processing smell. All right. Okay, so the hippocampus, what that does actually is can consolidate short-term memory to long-term memory storage. And mammillary bodies are involved with also memory, recollective memory, bringing things back, recall, and spatial memory as well. And number 20, getting closer. Can I erase that? So for number 20, all I wanted you to do was label the lobes of the cerebrum. So you don't necessarily have to label all these things, but we should be able to label the frontal lobe. Don't really need to label that one. Don't really need to label this one. The next one I'm looking for really is the top and the sides, which is called the parietal lobe. And then down on the side, so down here, which is the temporal. And then in the back, which would be the occipital. So on this one, just another view here. So on the side, temporal. This is the top side, that would be parietal. And then this is pointing to the frontal. All right, so Wernicke's area is called the general interpretive area. So this is an area where we can actually kind of recall, kind of have visual memories and auditory memories that we can process together and use. So this is kind of plays a large role in our personality. And it is in the left hemisphere. And its temporal lobe. Everybody good with that? And Broca's area is involved with speech, the breathing, and vocalization, coordinating that. So it's also going to be left hemisphere, but farther up in the frontal lobe. And then we have the prefrontal cortex. Super important part in terms of what sets us apart from other organisms is how advanced and complicated our prefrontal cortex is. And this allows us to focus attention. But what's really special for us is this is an area that allows us to think about future consequences, planning, and future consequences of our actions. So sometimes that takes a little longer to fully develop, and that's why sometimes little kids make poor decisions. And some adults don't fully mature, I guess. All right, so that is 1 through 23, finally, all done.